Dune Revenant, Chapter 1, 20,525 after Guild. The present inquiry of the fish speaker schools has its origins in a long-forgotten crisis. Knowledge of the events surrounding the millennia called the Scattering, and subsequently, the great integration that followed, is critical to understand the people of that ancient time. The discipline of the spice dreamers and their ability to reconstruct and disseminate the personae of our past humanity has provided us a tool of utmost importance. Through their efforts, we have discovered a wealth of archaeological information, a temporal strata open to us that has allowed a reconstruction of what in ancient times would have been called history. Remember that multiple memories and persona shifting were not common traits of our human ancestors. This fact was among the most alarming and revolutionary of all those made by the spice dreamers. People's minds were once solitary and alone. Socio-temperament of the fish speaker school, Ida Mirabla. Thunin stood alone at a podium facing a crowd that filled the great hall to capacity. The hall held over 1 million people, which made it the perfect meeting place for the first millennial celebration of the founding of the fish speaker schools. But this was not what held Thunin's interest. I stand before 1 million individuals, but my thoughts are on the design of this place. The design of the great hall of the Ida Mirabla school was influenced by the original temple to Saint Alia of the Knife. Although Arrakis had been destroyed some 2,000 years before, the blueprint of the temple had been saved in a Rydulian crystal. Legend says recorded by the tyrant god Guldur himself. Guldur must have cherished the design himself, the sweeping bow of the 1,000-meter outer wall leading to the knife, a 1,000-meter spire rising above. Thunin called him by the common name of Guldur, although as a historian he knew the tyrant god's name was actually Leto II. This thought out of time pleased Thunin, and calmed him as he prepared to speak. The temple to Saint Alia was chosen for size, although several structures on various fish-speaker worlds would have sufficed. All the major schools were convening here on the planet Uadra. However, for its rich history dating back to the first dozen fish-speaker schools, known in ancient times as Chapter House, Uadra was home to the Ida Mirabla school, the school Thunin acted as chosen representative for during these celebrations. Hundreds of events surrounding the millennial celebrations, each suited to the quasi-familial roles and goal groups the various schools were founded on, as well as lectures to be given by representatives of each of the fish speaker schools. Thunin looked across the banners of the various groups and listed them off to himself, once again to calm his nerves as the roar of the shuffling crowd came in preparation for his lecture. Harkon Mohia, Chani Tej, Halak Uadra, even the members of Hate Skydal abandoned their isolationist views for these events. Some discussions were specialized for smaller interest groups, while several dozen speakers were to address the entire assembly, all over the course of several standard days. The suspenser card read the title of his lecture to all those who entered the hall: Spice Dreaming as a Technique of Historical Archaeology, Ida Mirabla Fish Speaker School, presented by Thunin Ida VII Eden Alida Mirabla, socio-temperate archaeologist. As he began sometime after the movements settled, gradually entering in for what for Thunin marked a lifetime achievement, his eyes fixed upon the prismatic colors of the sun-sweep window calendar at the far end of the hall. I look into the pathways of light in this ancient calendar as I take steps to undo what we all know as time. The crowd of nearly 1 million reached an eerie silence, and Thunin began. We are assembled here in reverence to the accomplishments of that 1,000 years of progress historically called the integration. Before our ancestral schools were formed in those ages when the scattering was ended and the returning commenced, a great overcoming took place. Today we stand here as a testament to both the irreconcilable uniqueness of our individual schools, as well as our ability to retain the individual amidst such an integration. We are in agreement that the archaic concept of humanity, although of only minor significance to individual life, once was a rallying word for pre-integration beings. While persona shifting and multiple memories have become common traits among individuals in all the major schools, the question of how these changes came about has long remained a mystery. The origin of the fish-speaker schools are shrouded in the lost ancient histories, but a recent historical archaeological technique, spice dreaming, has uncovered keys to this lost past. In much the same way that guild navigators once folded space as a means of space travel, the spice dreamers have learned to fold consciousness as a means of time travel. We are a people riddled by questions. How have we acquired the variety of schools we know today? What are our origins? Different schools approach this knowledge differently. Our common mythos is open to interpretations. Talilaxo originary Evo theory. Bene Gesserit mythogeneticism. We stand ready for a new approach to this trance of truth. I have taken the liberty of presenting a series of spice dream discovered temperance from the dawn of the integration and the dawn of our very fish speaker schools. Know that the seeds of the integration were sown out of the conflicts beginning with the merging of two great but warring schools, the Bene Gesserit and their rivals, the Honored Maters. Thunen explained the details of the process of the spice dream. The individual conduit ingested synth spice to broaden the band of consciousness. Although most individuals possessed multiple memories and could share personae passed on within a school's line, the technique of a consensual vision had only recently been discovered. The process of the spice dream allowed a number of people to experience an actual historical moment by a dilation of the fabric of consciousness. Thunen glossed over the space-time figures, simplifying the idea as a cross between the ability to fold space and the techniques of Duncan's net. This consensual hallucination allowed history to be re-experienced, as easily as reading a history book had been 10 millennia ago. Thunen paused as he was joined at the podium by a young conduit named Yanima from the Nori Amper School. The Nori Amper School maintained a strong backbreeding with the original Ixian gene pool that had been in fashion these days, which also suited the school's members to the technical expertise of large-scale spice dreaming. Anyone can learn to fold the consciousness of a few proximate people, but there were a lot of threads to track and a level of discretion to drop insignificant threads that required a spice dreamer with the Ixian background to manage such a large event. As Yanima prepared for the trance, Thunen prepared the assembled crowd to receive the dream. Within moments, the place and the moment began to fade from Thunen's thoughts, and like the mundane dreams it was named for, the spice dream began to work upon his consciousness and the consciousness of the assembly. We can never experience the spice dream of another, yet we know they are all coinciding within the intents of the spice dreamer. As Yanima continued the process, folding consciousness, turning back the moments both from physical and psychical evidence, the million assembled individuals began to share the historical hallucination, each thought woven to the fabric of the desired target. Thunen's last thoughts were on Yanima, who was an alpha line bred direct from Hui Nori herself, her silhouette cutting the light from the sun's sweep window. She is as beautiful as was the consort of God. And then they were transported. The Gola, Paul Atreides, was alone in the courtyard when Miles Tegg entered. The boy looked around, quite aware of his progress was being watched from above by perhaps Shiana or one of the other sisters. Paul was right, of course. Shiana and Duncan Idaho were awaiting the practice session in order to monitor his progress. Duncan was outraged, and he said so to Shiana. "What is the purpose of all this, Shiana?" "Don't go there, Duncan. We both know that things are at work around us that are larger than your discomfort at training Paul." She always called him Paul, never the Gola. When I was young, Mother Shuangyu always referred to me as the Gola, never as Duncan. But Shiana is no longer Bene Gesserit. He watched the pair in combat training below, and Shiana turned up the listening device to eavesdrop. Paul was angry. Where is Duncan? Isn't he going to be teaching me to use plasma weapons? Where is Duncan? I remember when the original Paul used to request my company, while I watched on with his father, Duke Leto. So many lives, and I've returned to this. As Shiana spoke to Duncan and watched Paul and Miles training below, she realized the concept of Gola had never seemed natural to a Bene Gesserit, even though they had manipulated genetic lines for so many millennia. They always allowed a natural birth from two parents. The idea of genetics engineering shared the disapproval that computers gained after the Butlerian Jihad. The technology around the field forbidden by its edicts include computerized biotechnology. Only the Bene Tleilax practiced it, and they always denied they did, while the Bene Gesserit used conventional breeding. But it was now the second generation of Bene Gesserit sisters that were comfortable with the use of Tleilaxu axolotl tanks for custom-growing Golas. Not only had they produced their own successful Duncan Idaho, but they had also surpassed all when they produced a young Miles Tegg. The next project seemed inevitable. Overseen by Shiana and her band of renegade sisters, the creation of a Gola unlike any Gola project preceding it. They would bring back to life the strangest attractor of the ancient world. They would create a Gola of Paul Atreides. Paul cried out as Miles landed a blow. All right, lad, that's enough hand-to-hand for today. Let's move on to those plasma weapons you spoke of earlier. Miles glanced up at the observation window, and both Duncan and Shiana knew what his face told. Paul's reactions are too slow to survive. He's a relic of a past age. Duncan gazed out at Paul and sensed the strange feeling that everything he did was being watched by some unknown observer. And the spice dreamer ceded. The assembly's murmurs grew as they awaited Thunan's response. As the din of conversation rose in the great hall, Yanima gave a knowing look to Thunan as she left the scenum. Her eyes tell me that she thinks they're pleased with the demonstration. But will they believe the truth behind what their consciousness has just experienced, for all our sakes? What we have revealed is a key, the proof for once and for all that there truly lived a man named Paul Atreides. The evidence before us is obvious. Why would the memories lie? Many have claimed the very idea of a Kwisatz Haderach was a myth constructed by the master face dancers, somehow interwoven within our very cellular memories. I offer this memory as proof that Paul Atreides did exist. Why create a twice-fallen god? The historical law of least probability demonstrates that it would have been absurd to create such a wild story, where an imaginary man-god is fabricated and then reconstructed as a Gola, who is less than his origin, is such a bizarre tale that it must be true. A voice from the crowd sounded, "Of course you are familiar with the idea of Gola degradation theory." Thunan explained that Gola degradation would not be an issue as the dynamics of spice streaming would still be fixed to a true psychical moment in the past. As soon as this question was answered, another arose, continuing to counter the spice dreamer findings. Thunan half listened as he watched the sun-sweep window and thought of the fact that it was a representation of all ancient calendars up until its creation. When the voice was finished, Thunan resumed his findings, letting the light paths from the grand window somehow focus and guide him. The lecture continued for some time. After the flood of questions and personal greetings, some hours later, Thunan found himself alone in the cloisters of his chambers. He reclined back into the chair where he had done most of his research. As a historian of the era that produced the integration, Thunan infrequently found himself alone these days. The increased interest in integration origins were due to the millennial celebrations. Even the spice dreaming could not be done alone. But it was much more vivid to have multiple dreamers reconstructing a memory or a scene from the ancient past. Yanima would have been along soon enough, with the others of the students of Ida Mirabla School. Thunan would get back to the Tleilaxu memories, which were where his current priorities lay. The Tleilaxu memories are not history. They are the key to all of our futures. Thunen had a strong backbreeding to the original children of Duncan and Mirabella, and although the practice of Duncan Golas continued up until 2,000 years before, the Ida Mirabla school kept to the actual offspring, unlike the solipsistic Hayat Idaho school that crossbred in with various subsequent Duncan Golas. Ida Mirabla was more like a family than a school, a relic preserved from its founders. Thunen himself was one of 3 Golas born on the same day, although rarely interacted with his 2 twin brothers. As a historian, his focus had always been in the past. Thunen had perfected the technique of multiple spice dreamers reconstructing the same historical moment in a revolutionary way. Each spice dreamer became responsible for the thread of a central character in the past, and as the long-dead persona interacted through the dream, each dreamer kept a tight hold on his assigned persona. Some target moments even had auxiliary spice dreamers focusing on interpersonal communication or even collective subtexts. This way, more internal detail could be obtained and the scenes came across with a greater resolution of internal dialogue, stray thoughts that were the historian's bread and butter. His thoughts wandered back to a spice dream he had constructed a dozen times before, to a time he thought he felt had a historical poetry about it. The present faded, and Thunen heard the years recede with a sound he always likened to the wind rushing through the reeds from his childhood. The association pleased him, and over the years he had nurtured it. So the hours spent in his small boat on the river of his childhood home were never lost. Soon there was no room in his consciousness for anything other than the spice dream, and the dilation of time brought him back to the time soon after the destruction of the original Arrakis. His target was a nose ship in search of a home. You've been listening to an excerpt of Dune Revenant, a 7th Dune Novel fanfiction, Chapter 1, a pontos fathom audiobook. To continue the story, click the links below. Visit our webpage at www.pontosfathom.com and check out our other audiobooks on YouTube and on our Patreon. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.